Okay, people are still joining us, but I want us to get moving because we have a lot to get through this evening. I am absolutely thrilled to introduce this webinar tonight. It is truly has been a collaborative project across a lot of organizations who have been coming together for the Human Animal Support Services external medical working group. And we have a 3-part series, which these folks can tell you more about, that sort of couple the toolkits that are on our website and have come out recently, also authored by these brilliant minds. So without taking up any more of y'all's time, thank you so much for being here and for helping to educate all of us about what we can do to help keep pets and people together. So tonight we have starting from scratch, and I will send it back over to y'all. Thank you so much. And I'll be back at the end to field some questions for you.
Thank you, Rory. Well, as we know it and why we're all here is the world of animal welfare is changing. So Human Animal Support Services, or HAS's primary goal is to keep people and pets together. So that means we're bringing animal welfare organizations and community members together to build a system so that we can better address the needs of communities. So working together, we're creating and sharing resources such as our toolkits, policies, and trainings so that we can create meaningful institutional change, ultimately reducing shelter intake and the number of animals housed in animal shelters. So our webinar tonight is on starting from scratch. It's the first part in the access to veterinary care, community care models to prevent relinquishment. My name is Maria Anselmo. I'm the Community Relations Manager at the Montgomery County Animal Services and Adoption Center in Durwood, Maryland, where I oversee our foster rescue program, our outreach programs, as well as our volunteer programs.
And I'm Dr. Kelly Myers, and I'm from Michigan Humane, and I am their Chief Medical Officer overseeing the doctors at Michigan Humane, as well as our behavior department. And I've been with Michigan Humane about 8 years, and kind of had a non-traditional journey to animal welfare, and really come from more the business and management side of veterinary medicine. With that, Linda, would you like to say a few words?
Hi, I'm Linda Jacobson. I am a veterinarian at the Toronto Humane Society. My current role is managing the Shelter Medicine Advancement Department, where I'm responsible for research, education, and some of the strategic aspects of how the shelter runs. Very honored and thrilled to be here tonight.
All right, so you can see in this graphic that we've got that there are so many different reasons that people have to give up their pets. And you can see pretty big up there is health of animal and cost medical. And so, these reasons show us that there is a need that we can address to have an impact in our communities, which is what leads us to our next slide of the 3 models for access to care. Every situation is different, so there can't be a one-size-fits-all approach. And so the external facing medical care working group divided into 3 subgroups to create different models. And hopefully one of those models, as outlined in the toolkits, will provide a guideline on how you can get started increasing access to care. One of the first things we did in our working group before we split up into those subgroups was collectively define the guiding principles we wanted to base our work on. So to start with, all animals deserve access to medical care. That means reasonable treatment options and barriers to care such as cost, language, and transportation are removed. That we're client and patient centered. So we're committed to helping people and animals, meaning all animals in a supportive environment deserve to stay there. And people are assumed to be doing their best and are treated with compassion and empathy. And economics isn't a barrier to pet ownership. We believe in safeguarding life and quality of life, which means we advocate for doing something in order to avoid doing nothing. All animals deserve our best effort and a humane outcome, regardless of circumstance. We create partnerships with the veterinary community and other organizations and leverage existing resources when possible. The solutions and programming should be supportive of shelter staff and operations. It needs to be sustainable and humane for shelter staff, and it's got to be budget neutral. And of course, we've got to stay within legal statutes and professional guidelines or engage in changing them. So what does success look like for an access to care program? These are the things that we laid out as markers for success. That's your financial sustainability, a high percentage of animals staying with their owners. Those animals that are truly in need get help. There's a robust following to the movement to ensure that constant support and those legal and regulatory requirements are met. So it really takes a village. No single person can save the world. And so these are the major contributors to the Starting a Facility from Scratch toolkit. And you know what? We're literally a bunch of strangers who came together with a common goal. And that's really what HAS is all about. We're from all across America. So let's get ready to dive in there. While catnip is more fun, we need to eat our broccoli. So we're going to be talking about what to some people are pretty scary, but important topics. Yep, that's going to mean budgets and business plans. So by the end of our presentation, hopefully you'll see that budgets are fun, or at least tolerable. So get ready to be the golden retriever. Don't be the Labrador. Have some enthusiasm and you learn something. So there are many elements in the toolkit, and we are not going to cover them all today. That would take entirely too long. We'll have a link to the toolkit at the end of the presentation, and I highly recommend you take a deeper dive for examples of many of the things we're going to talk about and even more. So we're only going to touch on a few of these items, but they're very well detailed in the toolkit. So make sure you take a look at it, and you may be able to find something really helpful. So our journey today, these are the topics we are going to cover from the toolkit, and that would be our community assessment, different models, common pitfalls, writing that business plan, that scary budget, gaining buy-in from your leadership, and of course, what is the first step? The community assessment. You'll hear this a lot when you start looking at programs about engaging your community and any of those community-based programs. And so these are questions that you need to think about before you start one of these programs. And these are, what's the community need and want? Where are those needs greatest? What's already being met and where? And can you partner with any of those existing services? But I also want to cover how you actually figure that stuff out. It's really easy to say, like, yes, we know there's a need for veterinary care, but what is that need? And so some of that's going to involve a fair bit of research. One of the things to do is mapping services, so figuring out where your veterinary deserts are. So I've listed Google Business Extractor, which there's a link in the toolkit too, and it's a pretty neat add-on that will actually scrape data out of Google Maps for businesses and puts them in a lovely little Excel spreadsheet, and it's really cool. And that will really give you a baseline of all of those services. It does take some trial and error. It's not perfect, but it will give you like a good chunk of the services in the area. But one of the things you have to remember when you're using that and trying to map out those veterinary deserts is you also need like a population density map or heat map for that. Because you may take a look at your county or your community and see these huge spaces where there's no veterinary service at all. You know, that's truly a veterinary desert. But it also turns out it's just a real desert and no one lives there. So you do have to keep that in mind when you're figuring out where services are. And the next thing is your CAP surveys, which are knowledge, attitude, practice surveys. Now, these are things that are more following up on what your community wants. So we're not running in there with the savior complex. We need buy-in from the community as well. So CAP surveys can be super useful when it comes to identifying needs, problems, and barriers in program delivery, as well as coming up with solutions for improving quality and accessibility. So EpiCollect, which I've listed there, is a free tool that you can use on mobile, where you can create these CAP surveys with whatever you want on them and go door to door and interview people and collect a baseline of data. That way you can figure out what barriers actually are in reality. You know, is it cost? Is it transportation? Is it language barriers? So you can figure out what the problem really is in the area. And of course, you also want to involve your community leaders. So get in touch with them, have town halls or join forums, really get out there in the community, because knowing your community and having a baseline of data is going to be the first step in figuring out the why.
All right, which leads, thank you, Maria. So that leads us to why. So as you're looking at whatever project that whatever problem you're going to solve within your community around access to care, really start with the why. Why are we doing this? Why do we want to do this? And really state clear objectives to what it is that you want to solve. What problem are you trying to solve? What specific problem? What do you need to do that? And what does the community need? As Maria mentioned, what we might think the community needs and what the community really needs might be two separate things. So really make sure that you understand what it is what specific problem you're trying to solve. Be sure that each invested party agrees upon the objectives. So whenever you get started on this project, and we're going to talk about sort of a stepwise fashion of how you might be able to add access to care or a veterinary hospital. And we developed this toolkit so that you potentially, depending on your resources and what problem you're trying to solve, could plug in at any point along this journey. So make sure that everybody is on that same journey, because your finance person or your veterinarian or your shelter director or your ACO officer or that community member, they might all have different objectives, and really spending some time at the beginning, really talking through what it is that you want to solve and what it is that you're going to do, so that everybody is on the same page. Watch out for project creep. So what is project creep? Well, an example might be if you had a vaccine clinic and you decided to have a carnival at the same time. Both might produce revenue, both might be family oriented, but if you're really looking at access to care, the carnival might be creep to your project, might not be needed for your project. So another example is a veterinary clinic for intake diversion and low-cost veterinary care. So once you have that beautiful clinic with all of its capabilities and it's fully staffed, what else could we do with that clinic, right? And so then that maybe that project that you set out to do there might be other things that happen. And so just be careful that your project doesn't get too big or that it creeps in a direction you weren't intending. Okay, roadblocks to consider. So trying to solve the wrong problem. We've already kind of talked about this a little bit. Maybe you think spay neuter is going to solve the overpopulation problem. But if people out in the community don't actually want to spay neuter, you might have a spay neuter clinic, but nobody shows up in that community. So really looking at what is the problem that you're trying to solve and making sure that you're not trying to solve the wrong problem. Because maybe it is that they want spay neuter, but they can't get there. And so the problem you really need to solve is transportation, not providing spay and neuter. So trying to tackle it all at once versus in small manageable pieces. So when you're thinking about starting from scratch, it can be pretty overwhelming to think about adding a whole veterinary hospital with x-ray machines and doctors and a surgery suite and equipment and all of that, when you really could just start with a vaccine clinic in a park to out in a community that maybe is a veterinary desert. So we are going to show you with the toolkit how you can plug in any of those different areas. Not dedicating enough time to tracking data. So really understanding that the problem you're trying to solve, but then collecting data to prove that you did solve it or that you might need to readjust your project. Analysis paralysis. So though we want data, we don't want so much data that we can't move forward because we're in paralysis from the data. So be careful not to get too much data that it impacts operations or flow through. Cost control. So when we're thinking about a project, and this is where the broccoli comes in and the vegetables, we need to be thinking about cost control. And the two biggest ones really are overtime and animal supplies that can really get out of hand pretty quickly. And training needs. So though we need to train on protocols and processes and how to function day to day, in this type of work, we also have to think about communicating with empathy, culture, diversity, and navigation. So a lot of these families come with a number of problems, and helping our staff and employees navigate how to get those people help, not only with veterinary care, but maybe with other things that are happening within their families. So thinking about those additional training needs that you might need for this type of work. And then compassion fatigue, especially for your staff, to have empathy, but not have it so much that it impacts your ability to continue to provide that care. And then beware of competing priorities. So finite resources, dollars and DVM days. So maybe you have an existing shelter already that's got a full service, or that has a veterinarian that's doing 30 to 50 surgeries a day and doing rounds in your shelter. And you want to consider adding veterinary care. For every patient that DVM sees in your new veterinary practice is one less patient or one less shelter animal they're going to be able to see, one less round or sick case that they're going to be able to see. They can only see so many cases in a day. So really be thinking about what are your resources and what can you get accomplished with those. And then profit and mission or subsidized care. So some animal welfare organizations want to have veterinary care to add additional revenue to their operations, which is fine. But then remember that you're going to have to turn people away that can't pay in order to accomplish that profitability, which is maybe against your mission and what you're trying to accomplish. Those are definitely at competing priorities. And when you have that clinic and that ability to help, it becomes very difficult to make that decision in the moment for your staff and for your team as well. Efficiency and building relationships within the community. So high volume, low cost is very efficient. But if you really want to build relationships and gain trust with community members, that takes time. It takes a conversation, multiple conversations, and that isn't as efficient as we want it to be. So just remember that those two are often at conflict with one another. Empathy for community work and compassion fatigue. We kind of talked about compassion fatigue already and training around that, but these two can definitely be competing priorities as well. So we worry about compassion fatigue, but we also want them to have empathy, our team. So just helping them navigate that. All right. So in our toolkit, this graph is in the toolkit as well. And we really wanted to kind of call attention to needs-based models versus open to all models and the pros and cons of each. There really is no one way that works perfectly. And so just kind of considering the pieces of both. So in the needs-based model means that you're going to have a client come in and have to show proof that they are lower income. And so the pros of that is that it does restrict service to only those who need it. It will limit your client base. And the staff seem to be a little bit more on board with that because they feel like they're helping the ones that they need to help. The cons is that it can negatively impact dignity and agency. It can prevent maybe people seeking care that need it because they might be embarrassed or don't want to talk about that or don't want to show proof of that. It also can be really difficult to do administratively. It can take time. So when you talk again about efficiency, this would be the opposite of efficiency. And then how do you manage those situations when people show up and they don't bring their proof? Do you turn them away or do you see them anyway? And then you're really not doing a needs-based model. So as far as open to all, it's easy, it's more welcoming, less judgy. A slide scale can help with this as well. It's not quite open to all, it's kind of more limited, but on a sliding scale. Less administrative burden. The cons, the caseload can definitely be overwhelming because it will be open to all. And potentially could serve those less in need to the detriment of those that might have a greater need. And potentially pushback from the veterinary industry with that perception of competition. All right, so the way that we designed our toolkit is in a phased-in approach. So starting very small and working to that big, beautiful clinic. So starting with preventative care and microchipping, and then maybe adding in heartworm testing and prevention, then add in spay neuter, then add in basic sick care. Now you're talking, you potentially could offer owner-requested euthanasia, then extended sick care, advanced surgery, and then urgent or emergency care if you wanted 24-hour care on top of everything else. So the toolkit is less complexity to more complexity. And we also talk about what kind of facility you need and when you need to add in additional things. So microchipping or preventative care clinic, you can do almost anywhere with very little facility. Whereas an urgent or emergency care facility, now you need a building where you're providing that care on a consistent basis. Supplies. So for a microchip clinic, you really just need microchips and some volunteers. So from a staffing perspective. But if you're going to spay neuter, now you're talking about controlled substances, you're talking about a surgery suite, surgery table. You can still do spay neuter outside in a tent, but now you're starting to consider maybe I need a building. And then staffing, you need to add that veterinarian if you're going to be doing, so in Michigan, we have to have a veterinarian for rabies vaccination. So when you're adding vaccines, you need to add a veterinarian and technicians to restrain. If you're going to add heartworm prevention, now you're thinking about, all right, I've got to get some blood out of these animals to do a heartworm test. So there's different facility needs as you sort of build. But knowing that you can start small, and then as you build confidence and revenue, potentially, you can add on additional phases. Okay, so the other two, there's another toolkit that talks about leveraging existing relationships with veterinarians. And so if you have nothing and you're starting from scratch, really looking at different relationships that might be good to build in the beginning as you're starting small and then working towards that goal of a clinic. So starting with existing practices or maybe animal welfare organizations that already have veterinarians and starting to build those relationships, and they can help consult on what supplies you need or what's the best equipment. That would be a great resource for that. A lawyer, and that's really just to help with any contracts that you might do. If you do a partnership with someone, having that lawyer that you can call to help you, that you trust, to help you put together agreements or things like that. And then should you run into any problems along the way, you have someone to call that you're familiar with and you're not having to cold call someone when you're in the middle of a crisis. Same thing with an accountant. Budgets aren't your thing, then that's a good resource for you to get. Marketing development as you're looking at launching a project. And then of course, those much needed volunteers as you're looking at staffing what you are going to do. All right, so now we're gonna start getting into the how-to. And so we're gonna start with the business plan. So a business plan is really like your playbook. It's something that you're gonna refer back to. It's something that you're gonna be able to share, whether it's with an accountant or whether it's with stakeholders. So spending some time working on your business plan and your executive summary is really important. Much like you spent a lot of time planning and you spent a lot of time figuring out the why and the defined objectives of your project, in this case, a veterinary hospital, really spending some time here with the business plan. So you're gonna define the purpose, which you've already done that work. And then you're gonna ensure that the financial and logistics nuts and bolts have been thought through, convince funders that you're ready and you have a viable plan. Hold on one second. Ensure that a sustainable model is in place, define timelines, and create measurable and realistic goals. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is metrics, and thinking about metrics that you might want to include in your business plan, or things that you would want to track. And so here are some examples. Other things, if you're looking at more of a balanced or a for-profit veterinary practice, you're also going to want to look at average transaction, as well as the number of pets. That's how you're going to kind of look at revenue and project out revenue. The number of clients, surgeries, different types of surgeries. That's always fun to go back and look at as you're talking about this to stakeholders of, you know, how many animal lives you saved and the different types of things that you're doing with their funding, for example. Obviously euthanasia and lives saved from euthanasia. And as we talk about intake diversion, how that intake might have changed. Maybe it's gone down, or maybe you're really focusing on the number of parvos that are coming into your shelter and you're going out into the community and doing a vaccination project. So looking at, maybe it's a particular zip code that you looked at. And so tracking that zip code, tracking the number of parvos that are coming into your intake, and how you're impacting that with your project is an example of how you could use metrics. Okay, so the business plan layout. So at the very beginning of your business plan is a summary, also called your executive summary. And we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about the executive summary. So I'm going to skip it here, but you're actually going to do that last. It's at the beginning of your business plan, but you're going to create it last. So in your business plan, the main part of it is going to be these bullet points. So who's the leadership? Who's going to be managing this particular? So we're going to just say a veterinary hospital. Who's the leadership and management of the hospital? Is it going to be a separate entity or part of something current? What's the model? So we talked about different types of models that you could have. If it's low cost or no cost, how are you going to fund it? What services will you or won't you offer? And being very specific about that, I think is pretty important, especially as you first start out. And if you have limited resources, really defining what services you will and won't offer and giving those tools for your team is pretty important. How are you going to staff it? And then building out plans, construction and startup costs, your budget, and who are your clients? What is the clientele that you're targeting for your veterinary practice? And then you also want to include market potential, location analysis, development and grants, sales and marketing strategy, and a break-even analysis. So if you're going to go out and get a mobile unit, it's good to include, they usually say about 5 years of financials so that you can see when you're going to break even or pay back that mobile unit if you're going to take out a loan. So a break-even analysis is something you also might need to include depending on how much money you have or don't have at the beginning of your project. All right, so just like the chocolate lab, this cat's like, oh, budget. So I always joke around with a colleague of mine, Dr. Cece, who doesn't like to talk numbers, and I'm a little different and I love numbers and statistics and data. So this cat reminds me of Dr. Cece every time I start talking about budget and numbers. So we're going to dive into the budget just a tiny bit today. And I get a little bit excited and giddy, so stick with me. When we're thinking about a startup budget for really any project, but we're going to use a veterinary hospital in this particular situation, let's talk about a mobile unit. You have some startup costs. So the facility, the actual mobile unit, maybe there's some supplies or equipment. You have to staff that mobile unit, stock that mobile unit. You might have marketing, legal, or admin or setup. So don't forget about your startup costs when you're developing your budget. And then you have ongoing costs, and really it's revenue and expenses. And so we'll talk about revenue first. Only way to get revenue is average transaction number of pets. And so I like to, when I set up a budget, even though we might have subsidized care or free care, I still like to, when you're setting up your software system or you're setting up how you're going to track what happens with every client, I would set it up as if it is a for-profit, going to be getting cash for every transaction. And then you can always discount that work off. And the reason that that works so well is that you can go back and track everything that was done for those clients. But then also, if you're trying to balance profit and mission work, you can also see what work was done by the doctors and the staff, and if they were paying clients, what that revenue would be. So when you discount it off, then you can really track the mission work, especially as you're balancing, again, that profit and mission work. And then don't forget, and we're going to talk about this actually in a second, so we'll come back to that from a revenue perspective. And then expenses are really into two buckets. You've got variable expenses and fixed expenses. And that's only if you have you go all the way to the clinic side. If you just have a little vaccine clinic, you might not have fixed expenses like facility or utilities. You're likely gonna mostly just have variable expenses. So the way that I think about fixed expenses is that's fixed. No matter if I see a client or don't see a client, we're gonna have to pay those bills. So that's your rent or your facility, that's your utilities, things like that. Variable is, all right, so if I do start to do some business, I'm gonna have supplies and people to do that business, and it will grow based on how the business grows. So it's a variable depending on the amount of business that I do. Okay, so a few tips and tricks on revenue when you're thinking about revenue and budgeting. Clinic work, really average transaction times number of pets. You can either see more pets or you can either have more money per transaction. That's really the only way that you can look at revenue coming in from a paying client, a typical private practice. But there are other ways that you can get revenue. So grants and major gifts, donations, credit programs like Care Credit, Align Care. There's a lot of information about Align Care and other ways that you can potentially get revenue to help subsidize the work that you want to do out in the community. And then when I'm putting together a budget, I think about things in 8-hour blocks. So sometimes veterinary teams will work 10-hour days, they might work 12-hour days, they might be part-time, they might only work 4-hour blocks, but to really make sure that everything is systematic, I think of things in 8-hour blocks, or what I call doctor days. So how many pets can you see in a typical doctor day? So I use that doctor day as an 8-hour block, and that just helps. If you have doctors that are working different shifts and things, it just helps to kind of make everything even and easy to talk about. All right, on the cost control side, When I think about costs, I think about it in buckets that add up to 100%. So your revenue is the full bucket of 100%. Your animal supplies should be about 25%. Your labor, anywhere from 50 to 60%. And fixed costs, 15%. Profit, 0 to 10. Now, if you don't have a facility, a clinic, you might not have as much fixed costs, so you can spend more or make more profit, depending on how you look at it. So if you don't expect a profit, you can spend more on labor or animal supplies. And then remember, if you're not bringing in a lot of revenue, but like if you have subsidized care, for example, then you're going to still have those costs associated with it. So your percent of the whole is going to get bigger. So just be thinking about all of those different pieces, but generally they have to add up to 100%. So if you get product donations, you can also spend more on labor, or that maybe have profit to spend on a different project. Okay, so now that executive summary, we're going to come back to it. Remember, that's the first page of your business plan. It needs to not be more than 1 page. And this kicks off your business plan. So it's the 2 seconds that you have for the audience to get a good idea of what's going on in this particular plan. So you need to fit multiple audiences, but really gear it towards leadership, board, stakeholders, a banker if you're going to go for a loan. And it includes enough to describe the scope, but again, keep it to 1 page. So the layout, you'll have an opening paragraph of the executive summary, which is really a summary of the project. Think of someone that doesn't have a very long attention span and they only have like 30 seconds of attention. And so you really want to begin with what I call the grab. Want to grab their attention. What is that exciting thing that you want to accomplish? So you want them to read on. So this is your moment. You need to make it count. So do you want to decrease costs by $100,000 while saving 10,000 more lives? So you got the bean counters or the accountants by talking about decreasing cost and saving more lives. You've got the doctor's attention, shelter med. You've got people in the community. So thinking about that, those first couple of statements to describe your project, but also do it in a very engaging way. Okay, so the layout of the executive summary is you want to state the problem, tell us how you're going to solve that problem, the opportunity that you have to solve the problem, competitive advantage, the model that you're going to use, who's going to do it, the promise, so what do we get out of it? And then the ask, what do you need to make it happen? That's pretty straightforward. All right, and I think I'm going to turn it back over to Maria.
Thank you. Yeah, so now we're going to talk about getting everyone on board, which is very much like your executive summary. That means you need to know your audience, but think about that elevator speech or that 30 seconds where you've only got this short amount of time to really get them on board with your project. So think about what your sound bites are. And you do that by starting with the why and telling the story. Who is it that we can help that we didn't help yesterday and how this will change things? It's important to also know your audience when you're talking, whether it is your finance people or your doctors, because really no significant projects or initiatives going to be able to occur without the support of everyone in and around your organization. But luckily, you've written up this, super thorough business plan, and you have this fabulous executive summary. So this part should be a piece of cake. All right, so you've got yourself an approved plan. You've got funding. Everybody's on board. Now what? Really, what happens now is step off that edge. Go ahead and do it. Set a launch date. Start small and see what success looks like, and then you can grow from there. You may want to consider doing a soft launch once you've set that launch date. because you open those doors and people will come. And it's always best not to get overwhelmed when you first start. So consider that soft launch. If you went with one of the more complex models, and you're talking like the full veterinary facility, you may need that project manager to help keep goals consistent and make sure everything's running along smoothly. And then you've got to capture those key metrics. Don't forget the metrics. What gets measured gets valued, and that's very important for you to be able to report back to your stakeholders. And once you've done all that, it's time to just go ahead and set your next goal. There you go. Any thoughts and questions? We're happy to take them.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I can see faces. Oops.
Awesome. So it looks like we have got one question, or we've got a couple of questions in our Q&A. For communities where it is necessary to start a new nonprofit vet clinic, what are some banks that will loan to new nonprofit organizations? Other tips for startup funding?
I will take that. I can't see you guys right now. I'm trying to fix my unshare, which I am technology deficient. So there we go. Perfect. Banks for new funders. I think it really boils down to that business plan and coming forth with a really strong and compelling message that shows that you've thought about cost, as well as how you're going to pay for it and how it's going to be sustainable. I think those are big pieces.
Great. There we go. And another one for you. What community leaders do you suggest targeting?
One of the big ones is going to be like your parish leaders. They're very involved in their community and what's going on there. So they're always a great start. And then there's also social service agencies. If you look at any of the social service agencies in your area, you can, get on 211 to find some if you're not familiar with any and don't have relationships with them already. But get in touch with those social services agencies because they'll also have connections in the community so that you can, find those people who are really going to be the leaders in getting people in the community the help they need. But definitely your leaders of parishes and those social services agencies out there.
Yeah, and to add to that, food banks and senior centers are great places to start. Because those services are already happening there. And it's pretty easy to talk about pet food at the same time you're talking about human food and pet care at the same place. So
wonderful, thank you. Can you provide tips for assessing the capacity of your medical team?
Yeah, I would love for Linda to jump in too. She feels comfortable, but yeah, I think in a clinic setting, it's pretty straightforward. It really, you can look at the number of pets and average transaction if you're looking at for profit. When you start to look at mission work, I think that's why it's so important to capture the productivity and look at what's happening with each pet to really look at that. We have a tendency to look at each doctor and treat them individually because some doctors are great surgeons and some doctors aren't and prefer internal medicine. And so really looking at each doctor's skill set and looking at what they can accomplish. When you look at the shelter side, really capturing all of the different activities that they do, because I think we take for granted all the 5 minutes here and 5 minutes there, right? The number of foster appointments that they see, the number of surgeries that they do, the rounds that they're doing, the questions that they're answering. all of those different pieces and really capturing those to look at it. So I'm hoping that I answered your question. There is, okay, perfect. Okay.
Amazing.
I just add to that that I think a lot of the medical team's capacity depends on what you're doing. So if you're asking people to give a vaccination, that's just a couple of minutes. But if you're doing a full mouth extraction for feline gingival stomatitis, that's going to take a good couple of hours. So that's why it's important to be really clear about what you do and don't do, because that's really going to affect the capacity. The other thing that I think will really affect capacity is how organized and streamlined you are. And having clear SOPs that people follow will save an enormous amount of time, rather than trying to reinvent common wheels as conditions pop up.
Wonderful. Thank you both. I started a private foundation that will create a feline free roaming adoption center and a cat cafe that also provides in-house veterinary services. The plan will be to have a veterinarian on staff to perform all medical and surgical procedures. Can you give me an idea on the cost of setting this up? X-ray machines, ultrasound, blood test equipment, surgical tables, etc. It will be strictly cats.
I'm so sorry.
No worries.
Teenagers that needed to go somewhere. So I didn't catch the end of that question. Was it equipment?
Yes. So cost of equipment of setting up a private foundation for, let's see, a private foundation that will create a feline free roaming adoption center and cat cafe that also provides in-house veterinary services.
Oh, wow. So I think it depends on what type of veterinary services that you're going to provide. But in the toolkit, as we talked about that phased in approach, there is a phased in equipment that you need and a phased in supplies that you will need. So if you're just doing a vaccine clinic, we give you the kind of general categories of equipment or supplies that you would need, versus a clinic where maybe you're going to do vaccines and sick care, and what additional equipment or supplies that you might need for that. So it's fairly detailed, but we also in the presentation gave our email address. So if you have additional questions, I'm happy to help.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Are new clinics having any trouble recruiting enough vets and vet techs to meet the business plan productivity projections?
That's a great question. The answer is yes. And I believe that's an international problem. I'll let Linda answer this as well. But yeah, there is, we've been talking a lot about this in our organization, and I know that they have been nationwide. There's about 5 positions for every veterinarian that's looking right now. I looked in just Michigan, there's 125 job openings. And at Michigan State, there is 100 new grads. So there's 25 more jobs than there are new grads graduating. And that problem is only going to increase as more pets get adopted and that's a great problem to have. Families with pets is a great problem to have, but we need more veterinarians. And for every veterinarian, there's hopefully at least 2 technicians. And so the tech problem is actually worse. We need more technicians than we need veterinarians. So I'm not sure if in Canada they're seeing the same thing.
Yeah, we're also seeing shortages. I would say that particularly since a lot of the people that will be coming into this will be coming from private practices or maybe new graduates, that it's probably really important to also provide training in spectrum of care and incremental care approaches. And that way you can get more done per medical team unit, if you like. So if everything is done for every animal, that's going to cost a lot of money and take a lot more time and a lot more staffing. Whereas if you are doing what that animal and that family needs, you may be able to get away with fewer people.
Wow, that's an incredible shortage. That's wild. So here's a really good question. Advice on getting buy-in from area veterinarians. We don't want to plow ahead and ruin the good relationships we have established, but every day we see the need for simple things like vaccinations and access to affordable spay-neuter in our economically challenged neighborhood.
Linda, do you want to take that or you want me to take it? Okay, I'll start. You know, I think that there is, as we talk about the veterinary shortage, I think actually now is the opportune time to start having these conversations because there's more work than there is people to do the work. I think that that was probably different 5 to 10 years ago. But having that conversation of, you know, hey, I want to start doing this and being open and transparent and keeping that relationship and showing them that you're still going to have that relationship going forward and how can they help and be involved in that as well. So there is a whole nother toolkit around having those relationships with existing veterinarians and navigating through that. So I would recommend also going and taking a look at that toolkit. Anything else you'd like to add, Linda?
Alrighty. My community's social services are not interested in being involved and just spout the same biases. If we give care to the pets of the homeless, that will just encourage them to have pets, et cetera, et cetera. So that really limits opportunities for developing partnerships. Any experience with this? Any advice?
I could take that one. So it is, you know, still something we're seeing even in the animal welfare world, those biases and judgments that people don't deserve their pets. So there's some people whose minds you're not going to change yet, and those aren't the people to focus on. You know, it may not be your biggest social service agencies that you're going to go to, but that's where like your parish leaders, they're going to be much more open than some of those, you know, bigger agencies, and finding the small ones or ones where food banks already are. You know, those food banks exist, and a lot of times those that have pet pantries as well. And it's going to be those people that are open or more open to assisting people. But I think it's a big movement that's going on. And I think it's quite possible that you're going to see changes, you know, in your community with those social services agencies. And I know there is another working group that is on working with those social services agencies that I think is working on a toolkit that will come out. But really, the more open and honest you can be and keep on trying, because, you know, when it comes to finding those social service agencies, it's like if you can manage to get in touch with like the one animal person that works there, and then it's a matter of convincing that one animal person of, you know, the benefits to the homeless of owning those pets and really what that bond does for those people. And that's going to be, you know, one of the key ways to make that change. But it won't be overnight. It is definitely something that is going to take time.
And I think kind of playing off of that, it's what's in it for them, right? Instead of leading with, we want to help more animal lives, what's in it for that human health organization, right? We know that pets make humans healthier. So really talking about how humans can be healthier with pet ownership. So really leading in it with that human health organization, what do they need? And it's to get their services out to those that need it. And so can you get the human health services to the people that you're already serving? And how does that go both ways? So looking at that relationship.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, we have time for one more question. So if you all had to give one thing that you want all of the people viewing this webinar to get from it, what would that be? I would love to hear from each of you. What do you want our attendees to take away from this?
I can go first. That's a really hard question. I think just off the top of my head, I think as everyone can do this work. It doesn't have to be big and dramatic. It can be tiny, it can be small. So bite off a piece of the cheese, don't try to eat the whole thing. But everyone can do this work, and it's going to take everyone doing this work in order to make a difference.
So my approach to that question is, I guess, a sort of a big philosophical approach, which is that if we see our role as not so much looking after animals and keeping animals in shelters, but supporting the human-animal bond, then that really frames this kind of work, and I certainly think that's the future of sheltering.
And you know, I hope some of the big takeaways people have is that you are not alone in this. And that's sort of the whole thing, is that we're here to collaborate. We're here to answer questions. You know, we're here to give advice, to create things with you. And that, you know, you need to talk to everybody else that's in this industry, because we're here for a reason. We're all in this industry because we care about both people and animals. So, you know, just knowing collaboration is the thing, and you're not alone. We don't exist in a void, and you can't save it on your, you know, save the world on your own. But hopefully we've given you some information so that you can save a little bit. And maybe you also took away that budgets are great, and, you know, they're super fun and exciting, and numbers are fabulous. I hope you learned that too.
And everybody should eat broccoli. Everyone.
Sneaking in some extras there. But those are so good. Thank you all so much for being with us tonight and sharing your expertise. You can find this toolkit on the Human and Animal Support Services website. I'm dropping the link in the chat right now. And a recording of this webinar will be emailed out to all of you early next week. Thank you again for joining us tonight. Everybody have a great night. Bye.